At the end of the Second World War, there was a set of gallows inside an American-controlled prison that saw a huge amount of action as the German concentration camp guards were sent crashing through the trapdoor for their execution. Many of these men were the former guards of Dachau Concentration Camp, the oldest camp which was opened by the Nazis. Dachau was a site of terror and torture, and there was also a huge amount of execution carried out there, and in total over 188,000 people found themselves locked up inside the camp within Upper Bavaria. Dachau was used for a number of war crimes trials after the war by the Americans, and some of the guards who worked here were known for their terrifying actions and behaviour. These guards had been given orders to be as brutal as they could, and the plan was to inflict horrifying ordeals onto the prisoners. But at the end of the war, as mentioned, some were executed for their actions. This is a full story of many of the guards of Dachau concentration camp who were executed. Welcome to The Untold Past. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Martin Gottfried Weiss was born in Bavaria in June 1905 and was raised as a Catholic. After he completed school, he attended a mechanical engineering school, and then in 1924 worked as an intern in the ironworks industry. Following this, he then worked for an electric company, but in the summer of 1926 he joined the Nazi Party and was considered one of the earlier members. Whilst being part of the party, he established a local group of the SA and also the Hitler Youth, with two of his friends in the area of Weiden. Whilst working inside of this, he also studied electrical engineering, then became an assistant at a school until April 1932 when he was let go. He then, following this, joined the SS. He served from April 1933 in the SS as a guard of Dachau concentration camp, following the prisoner numbers growing after its opening. Dachau was considered a prototype for other German concentration camps, and the complex became very large, and at the entrance gate the infamous phrase of Arbeit macht frei was displayed. It was a camp that was the longest in its operation, and it lasted almost all 12 years of the Nazi regime. Prisoners here were mainly German prisoners to begin with, who were held for political reasons, possibly being enemies of the Nazis. As time went on, more people were transported to Dachau, and over 188,000 people passed through the barbed wire fences. The SS were placed in charge of overseeing the camp, and Weiss would have worked doing this. The prisoners of Dachau were to serve as a forced labour force for a munitions factory to begin with, but then they were used to expand the camp. The camp included an admin building, roll call square, bunkers, barracks, and a savage punishment block, which was known for immense brutality. When the SS staff arrived, they were told that, "Comrades of the SS, you all know what the Führer has called us to do. We have not come here for human encounters with those pigs in there. We do not consider them human beings, as we are, but as second-class people. For years they've been able to continue their criminal existence, but now we are in power. If those pigs had come into power, they would have cut off all our heads. Therefore we have no room for sentimentalism. If anyone here cannot bear the blood of comrades, he does not belong, and he better leave. The more of these pig dogs we strike down, the fewer we need to feed." Inside of the punishment block at Dachau, there were also tiny standing cells like oubliettes. These were so small that prisoners could not sit down, and had to stand for days on end without any respite. They were sometimes taken out to work during the day, and then thrown back in afterwards. Some prisoners were given hardly any food, and the oxygen in these was not sufficient. Also, executions were common, and hangings occurred at Dachau to make an example of prisoners. Also, shootings took place with guards firing at those prisoners who did not work. Dachau's guards became very feared because of this, and Weiss initially worked as an engineer for 5 years, until February 1938. He regularly performed maintenance tasks at the camp, and then he became an adjutant to the commanders of the camp, Hans Loritz and Alexander Piakowski. He was a father and had 2 children and a wife, but in April 1940 he was sent to oversee the construction of a newly created Neuengamme concentration camp. Neuengamme saw 106,000 prisoners pass through the gates, and almost 43,000 were killed by the conditions there. It was established as a place to deliver building materials for building projects in Hamburg. Weiss became the commandant of the camp in April 1940 and remained here until June 1940, as the camp was a subcamp of Sachsenhausen to begin with. but when Neuengamme became a concentration camp in its own right, he remained until September 1942. The plan for the prisoners at the camp, overseen by Weiss, was that they would be exterminated through labour. Prisoners worked for up to 12 hours a day, and many were killed by the inhumane conditions and the violence from the guards. There was insufficient food and nutrition given to prisoners, and also the camp was very dirty and unsanitary, with disease running rampant around the camp. Medical supplies were also very scarce, and if prisoners were sent to the hospital, they were quickly killed by lethal injections. It was Weiss who oversaw the camp, and ultimately he was one of the ones responsible for the conditions there. But on the 1st of September 1942, Weiss was brought back to Dachau to become the commandant there. He was criticised with regards to the poor conditions of the prisoners, and following this he did try to improve things a little, but people were still being killed on a large scale. The health of the prisoners at Dachau ultimately led to prisoners not being as productive as they could, and this is why Weiss got criticism. He ordered prisoners to their deaths in euthanasia programs, and hundreds were sent to Hartheim Castle, where they were killed. He worked in Dachau until the 31st of October 1943, and during his time dozens of people were hanged, and dozens were shot by firing squads. Weiss later commented, saying that those people were not prisoners of the camp who were shot dead, but were prisoners of the Gestapo, who were the ones who issued the execution orders. He claimed that Himmler had sentenced those to death. It's believed that some prisoners did respect Martin Weiss, as he did make some changes to the camp. He allegedly banned deliberate beatings, and allowed food parcels, and also refused Himmler's orders to bomb and burn Dachau. But following his work there, he was appointed the commandant of the Majdanek concentration camp. He also became the commander there on the 3rd of November 1943, but on the following day one of the worst massacres occurred. In one day more than 17,000 Jews were murdered at the camp, but some historians claim that Weiss was away preparing himself for his new job whilst the massacre occurred, but on his first day in Majdanek he would have had to organise a clean-up operation following the killings. He was later in May 1944 promoted, and in the following November was sent to the Muhldorf subcamp. Whilst here 2 underground plants had been created to make fighter planes with prisoners from Dachau. The Luftwaffe was suffering heavy losses, and inside the plants they tried to create a number of aircraft for the war effort. Jewish prisoners who worked there were so terrified of being gassed if they did not work hard enough. Many died from the labour conditions, and some died from disease, and those who could not work anymore were sent to Auschwitz to be killed. But as the war was coming to an end in April 1945, Martin Gottfried Weiss was inside Dachau, possibly to take over as a commandant again. He was there when discussions took place to have the camp passed over to the Americans, but Weiss then went on the run. He was captured inside of Munich on the 29th of April 1945, and was then brought to trial at the Dachau camp trials. The trials were held at Dachau itself, and 40 people were charged with war crimes in connection with working at Dachau. The trial took place from the 15th of November to the 13th of December 1945, and the trial ended with 40 convictions, including 28 death sentences and executions that were carried out. The official name of the case was the United States of America versus Martin Gottfried Weiss et al. Witnesses were heard, and faced the defendants, and the court were told of the horrific treatment of prisoners. Martin Weiss was sentenced to death for his war crimes and his role as the commandant of Dachau and the other camps, and his execution took place on the 29th of May 1946. He had been transferred to Landsberg Prison, and whilst here 2 gallows had been made, and over the course of the post-war years, a large number of German war criminals were executed by hanging on the structure. Martin Gottfried Weiss was executed on the same day as many of his former staff who were convicted war criminals. He was brought from his cell at Landsberg and was then accompanied by a huge number of guards and military policemen and taken into the courtyard. He was led towards an official who confirmed his identity, and a priest also stayed with the group. Martin Gottfried Weiss was then taken up the stairs of the gallows step by step, and he was then handed over to the executioner. A few last words were asked for him, and then the executioner shuffled him over the trapdoor. He quickly placed a black hood over Weiss's head, before he then secured the noose and tightened it. Quickly he then released the trapdoor, and Martin Gottfried Weiss plunged to his death, and he then was confirmed dead, before his body was placed into a coffin. Martin Gottfried Weiss was found guilty of violating the laws and usages of war, and it was clear he was a war criminal who had overseen many concentration camps. Inside of these, thousands of people died and were executed and killed by the conditions that he oversaw. He was a prolific commandant and must have been valued by Heinrich Himmler, who ultimately put him in positions of power. Alexander Piorkowski was born in Bremen in Germany on the 11th of October 1904, and as a young man he was a mechanic, and then he worked as a travelling merchant in the aftermath of the First World War. He visited different areas, but was then attracted to the politics of the Nazi Party and Hitler. He became a member of the SA or the Brown Shirts in June 1929, but then after this he then joined the SS in June 1933. He also had previously become a member of the Nazi Party, and was seen as a reliable and effective leader of men and soldiers. Because of this he was given charge of the SS Standarte in Bremen, his hometown, and then he was given command the following year of the SS Standarte Allenstein. But despite being involved in the SS, he retired from service with the group for his health on the 19th of September 1936. But he was still seen as a reliable and useful member of the SS, and was then approached by Himmler to become the commandant of Dachau Concentration Camp. He accepted this position and was in control there for only a few months, from July 1937 to December 1937, before it was then converted to an all-female camp. Lichtenburg was a camp which was housed inside of a former Renaissance castle in Prettin near to Wittenberg in Saxony. It was one of the first to be built by the Nazis and was operated by the SS from 1933 to 1939. Over the years there had been many different commandants, including Theodor Eicher, who would also become the commandant of Dachau, but also Hermann Baranowski, who served at Dachau as a senior guard. Lichtenburg could hold up to 2,000 male prisoners to begin with, and then it underwent a significant transition in 1937, where the male prisoners were moved out and it became an all-female camp, years before Ravensbrück would be opened. The prison was rather run down, and as in most of the early camps, the prisoners were referred to as political prisoners, or prisoners in protective custody. All of the women would be transferred from this camp to Ravensbrück when it closed in May 1939, and this then replaced Lichtenburg as the main camp inside the Third Reich for female prisoners. It was a site there that over time had become very overcrowded as the Nazis rounded up more women, and the conditions there were rather poor, and it's believed food rations were not sufficient enough, and also disease was spreading there. Alexander Piorkowski remained here until August 1938, and was then transferred across to Dachau. To begin with, he served as a Schutzhoflagerführer, which was someone who was in charge of the economic production at the camp. Piorkowski was seen as an important administrator who was also known for mistreating victims and driving them to work harder to ultimately make more profit for the Nazis. He was involved in maintaining order, would have taken roll call daily and ensured law and order was maintained. It was a senior position, and underneath him were the Rapportführer and also the Oberaufsehrinz, and they were also responsible for the staff in some regards. But he was then made the commandant of Dachau, which meant he was in charge of the whole huge site's operation. Dachau, as mentioned, was a huge and colossal concentration camp, with over 40,000 people being killed there. Many different prisoners found themselves at the camp, including priests, and before Piorkowski came, there were many deaths that had already occurred. In his time in control, over 4,000 Soviet prisoners of war were sent to their deaths by Piorkowski, as he ordered them to be shot dead and executed at a nearby SS shooting range found 2 kilometres from the camp at Herberhausen. These killings were a terrible crime, and the first executions occurred on the 25th of November 1941. But during his time in control, the number of prisoners coming to Dachau rose heavily, and many thousands of people came there. The prisoner enclosure at the camp was heavily guarded to make sure that no one escaped, and guards would happily shoot at prisoners if they tried to escape. It was a site of pure terror, and Piorkowski was the one leading the camp, and horrific torture methods were used there to strike fear into the hearts of the inmates. Standing cells were found there, in which the inmates were thrown into a tiny cell, and were expected to be in there for days on end, and they could not sit in there, being forced to stand for 24 hours a day. Floggings took place in public too, with inmates who had infringed on the rules being whipped brutally. Some were even killed by this. Tree or pole hangings were used, in which an inmate was suspended from the air. Also, executions took place of prisoners who were not fit enough to work, and as time went on the conditions at Dachau became worse. Many died from disease, exhaustion, starvation and violence as time went on, and many would decide to simply touch the electrified fence to end their ordeal quickly. During Piakovsky's time in charge, hundreds of priests would be transported to Dachau too, and many were then selected to be used in horrific Nazi medical experiments. But on the 31st of August 1943, Alexander Piakovsky was then sacked as the commandant of Dachau, as he had been accused of corruption charges and embezzling money out of the camp. There were many former commandants of different camps who could just not help themselves, and for this he was sacked, and it's not known what he did after. But at the end of the Second World War, he was summoned by the US Army to trial, and the Americans forced him to answer in front of a judge about the crimes he had committed as the commandant of Dachau. His trial took place as part of the Dachau trials, from the 6th to the 17th of January 1947. Previously, many former guards had been sentenced to death and executed in the trials there, and Alexander Piakovsky was then charged with crimes against humanity, deportation, abduction and ill treatment of prisoners at Dachau. Many witnesses came forward to testify against him, and he was then sentenced to death for his crimes. Alexander Piakovsky then tried to overturn his death sentence, and he petitioned a number of times for a pardon, but regardless he was still taken to Landsberg Prison. This was a site where hundreds of Nazi war criminals would be executed after the war, and Piakovsky was held there before he was executed. On the morning of the 22nd of October 1948, after being held at Landsberg for over a year, he was taken out of his cell into a courtyard where the gallows stood. He was flanked by US military police officers and a priest, and he was led up the steps of the gallows after his identity was confirmed. He was then handed over to the executioner, who placed a black cap over his head and then the noose. Following this, he was shuffled over the trapdoor, and this was then released, and Alexander Piakovsky, the commandant of Dachau, was left hanging. After death was confirmed, he was then placed in a coffin and was then cremated. Alexander Piakovsky was the commandant of Dachau, who was responsible for the deaths of thousands inside one of the most evil concentration camps of them all. He helped to instill a reign of terror and told the guards to brutally beat and whip prisoners to make sure they fell into line. His death sentence at the end of the war was little justice for the people who were in prison there, but there was some debate as to how active Piakovsky was at his time in Dachau, as he has been accused of being someone who delegated most of his responsibilities that resulted in crimes to those people who were underneath him. But ultimately he met his end at the gallows of Landsberg Prison. Heinrich Wicker was born on the 30th of June 1921 inside of Baden-Württemberg, meaning that as the Second World War broke out, he was just a young man in his teenage years. But on the 9th of September 1933, Wicker became a member of the Hitler Youth. Inside of this, millions of boys were trained how to one day be a member of the armed forces, and they were schooled in how to become soldiers. They would learn how to fire weapons and would be trained in military drill, and the purpose of this was that in a few years, when the war broke out, Hitler would have a devoted young force who would lay their lives down for his Nazi regime. But before his 16th birthday, Heinrich Wicker joined the SS Totenkopfverbände, or the Death's Head Unit, and these men would be the staff of the concentration camps during the Second World War. Wicker was an incredibly young man to join this brutal group, and it shows how he must have been devoted to the Nazis and Hitler. But in November 1938, he was stationed inside of Dachau, the first concentration camp that would be opened, and many young men were sent here to train in how to become guards inside of the camps. But as the Second World War broke out, Wicker, like many men, were part of the Waffen-SS, the armed force battalions of the SS, the Eastern Front, and because of this, other roles were found for him. He completed SS leadership courses and was promoted to the rank of Oberscharführer, and he was moved to work in the local headquarters of the SS main economic and administrative office. Further promotions came, but then in 1944, in June, he was transferred to go and work back inside of a concentration camp. This time Heinrich Wicker was working at Natzweiler Struthof inside of French territory, and he would be made the commandant of one of the subcamps there. But whilst here he gained a reputation for being evil, and his treatment of prisoners was shocking, and he was known for his brutality, and he was very feared despite being only around 23 years old. He was obsessed with power, and he was then made the commandant in December 1944 of the Natzweiler Mannheim Sandhofen subcamp. It is most probable that Heinrich Wicker was benefiting from the fact many SS men were being transferred to the front line of the conflict as the Second World War was turning against the Germans, and as a young man who had been injured, he was gaining more power as other SS guards were moved out to fight for Hitler's remaining empire. When he was at this subcamp though, he did carry out executions, including the execution of a Polish woman who had been involved in sabotaging work. But at the end of the Second World War, Wicker did lead a number of death marches, forced movements of hundreds or thousands of concentration camp prisoners to sites away from the advancing Soviet and Allied armies, as Heinrich Himmler stated that no prisoner should fall into the hands of the enemy. On these death marches, Wicker and his men would slaughter hundreds of people, including during the Hessenthal Death March, where 170 prisoners were killed or they died from the conditions of their march. But there would be one final job for Heinrich Wicker, as on the 28th of April 1945 he was made the final commandant of the first concentration camp Dachau, but within 24 hours he would be dead. He is remembered as the last commandant, and it was he who on the 29th of April 1945 surrendered Dachau to General Henning Linden of the 42nd Infantry Division of the 7th US Army. Heinrich Wicker had been entrusted with the camp, whilst the former commandant Weiss abandoned it, and under his command were 560 men, many of whom who were Hungarian. When the camp was liberated, the American soldiers discovered 39 railway boxcars containing 2,000 corpses parked on the railway outside the camp. Remains were found scattered everywhere, and there was a horrific stench of decaying corpses and human excrement, as well as a sight of emaciated prisoners who were walking around with very little clothes on. Many of the liberators were sick and distraught by what they saw, and the advancing American soldiers told the SS members to surrender and to give up, but some continued to fire at the Americans. As the liberators moved closer, more bodies were found, and many rooms were found with hundreds of bodies inside. However, there would be a series of executions and reprisals carried out against the former guards, and Heinrich Wicker was caught up in these. A group of around 50 prisoners had been captured and were bundled into an area which had been used as a coal store, and this area was enclosed by a high wall. The Germans were looked over by a machine gun team, and Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks left these men to watch over their captives, but as he left them, a soldier shouted, "They're trying to get away," and their machine gun fire was heard. A 19-year-old soldier who manned the machine gun had mown down around 12 of the Germans and wounded many more. It was said of this event that it was a foregoing incident which has given rise to wild claims in various publications that most or all of the German prisoners captured at Dachau were executed. Nothing could be further from the truth. The total number of German guards killed at Dachau during that day most certainly did not exceed 50, with 30 being more probably an accurate figure. The regimental records for this date state that over 1,000 German prisoners were brought to the regimental collecting point. Since my task force was leading the regimental attack, almost all prisoners were taken by the task force, including several hundred from Dachau. There were other accounts that alluded to the executions of German guards inside of Dachau, and it was said some of the Nazis were rounded up and executed along with the guard dogs, near to where the men were shot, and there were more killings as around 25 to 50 guards were also slaughtered by the inmates. It was said some prisoners swarmed over the wire and grabbed the Americans and lifted them to their shoulders. Other prisoners caught the SS men. The first SS man elbowed one or two of the prisoners out his way, but the courage of the prisoners mounted. They knocked him to the ground, and nobody could see whether they stomped him or what, but he was killed. At times, American guards also turned a blind eye to the killing. But it's clear that Heinrich Wicker was executed at some point following surrendering the camp, as a final photograph was taken of him standing in front of one of the death trains, where there were many bodies inside. He had been ordered to be taken to a place where hundreds of corpses were stuffed into, but recent research has emerged in which a photograph showing a deceased SS German officer at Dachau, which appears to be Heinrich Wicker, shows his horrific ordeal. The officer in question is lying on his back on the floor, and he has been shot, but he also has a very battered and bloody face, leading to the idea that he was either set upon by the prisoners or by the American guards. It's more likely that he was shot by the Americans, who were carrying weapons, but he was one of those who was executed following the liberation of Dachau. There is some debate over this photograph, but he was killed following the liberation, as his wife would receive his war pension. Heinrich Vickar was only 23 years old when he was executed inside of the concentration camp he was given command of for around 24 hours. It was his job to surrender the camp to the Allies, as the former commandant ran off and vacated, but at his disposal were over 500 guards. He was executed by American soldiers or prisoners who were incredibly eager to inflict revenge and reprisal for their suffering. He was a very young man who had been involved in many crimes against humanity, as he led death marches at the end of the Second World War. But he was a virulent Nazi who would be responsible for the deaths of many people. Klaus Schilling was born in Munich on the 5th of July 1871, and as a young man he studied medicine at university in his home city, before he received a doctorate at the age of 24. He then became a professor of parasitology at the University of Berlin, and became a member of the Malaria Commission of the League of Nations. However, he then became an international doctor and was practicing medicine in areas of Africa colonised by the Germans. He was interested in particular in tropical medicine and malaria and how to stop this, and he began to become celebrated in this field. He, in 1905, before the First World War began, worked at the Robert Koch Institute as the first director of tropical medicines, and he remained here in this position for over 3 decades. Whilst inside of this, he developed new ideas and theories, but then retired in 1936. At the time in Germany, Hitler had come into power, but Schilling was attracted to one of Nazi. Following a meeting with the Nazi health chief, Leonardo Conti, Schilling came back to his homeland in 1941, and he then began to work again on malaria research. But instead of carrying out disturbing experiments on psychiatric patients, his research and work would take him into the concentration camp system. Inside of Dachau, Schilling was given a special malarial research station, and it was Himmler himself who allowed him inside of the camp to conduct his work. Many of his colleagues would criticise Schilling, but he remained in charge of the department throughout the whole of the war. In the 1930s, Schilling had stated that malarial research could be done in a harmless fashion on human subjects. However, at Dachau, his experiments were sadistic and unethical. At the camp, prisoners were drafted into the unit, and they were injected with a number of synthetic drugs at different doses. Some were given very high doses of different drugs, and others were given lethal amounts, which would often leave them in a catatonic state or even dead. After these injections, the patients were then exposed to malaria in a rather bizarre and sadistic way. They had cages filled with malarial mosquitoes strapped to their hands and arms to make sure they were then infected by the parasite. The scale of the medical trials was huge, and more than 1,000 prisoners were deliberately infected with malaria, a deadly disease for Schilling's research. Klaus Schilling's supposed research resulted in between 300 to 400 of these prisoners being killed, and a number of them were affected for the rest of their lives by his work, being permanently disfigured or injured. During Schilling's experiments, a number of priests who had been incarcerated inside of Dachau were executed and killed by his experiments. Dachau itself was a camp where over 180,000 prisoners would pass through the gates, but over 41,000 were killed there. It was a brutal camp where there was much fear and terror, with constant floggings and public executions, forcing the prisoners to fall into line. Other forms of punishment included the standing cells, but Schilling's work helped to contribute to the terror. After the liberation of Dachau, Schilling was arrested, and at this point he was around the age of 73. He was an elderly man by the standards of the other defendants in war crimes trials, but regardless of not joining the Nazi Party, he was brought to trial. During the Dachau proceedings, he was tried by a US military court, and along with 39 other defendants who worked at Dachau, he was brought towards a judge. The proceedings began on the 15th of November 1945, and Schilling and the other defendants all pleaded not guilty. Over the course of the trial, a number of witnesses and former prisoners came forward to testify about the evils inside of Dachau, including the terrible living conditions, the executions and punishments, and also the medical experiments that took place there. Klaus Schilling was seen as a slightly obscure defendant, as at the age of 74 he was the oldest, and despite not being a Nazi Party member or member of the SS, he was lumped in with the other war criminals. Schilling said he did not deny that he carried out the experiments, and admitted he had done this in the interest of science, and that suffering of the prisoners was done purely to advance medicine. Because of this, he even shockingly asked the court to allow him to finish his research and to write down his experiments. He said that he had nothing to do with Dachau itself and the evils that emerged inside the camp, and claimed that he did it purely for science. He stated, "I've worked out this great labour. It would be really a terrible loss if I could not finish my work. I don't ask you as a court, I ask you personally to do what you can to help me, that I may finish this report. I need only a table and chair and a typewriter. It would be an enormous help for science and for my colleagues, and a good part to rehabilitate myself." After this he cried, begging to finish his work, to regain his reputation. Schilling beforehand, let's remember, was a well-respected international professor, but inside the Nazi regime he became just another war criminal. The courtroom sentenced Klaus Schilling to death, rejecting his pleas. It was heard that the prisoners he used were from Poland, the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, and at the time there was no formal code of ethics regarding medical research that the doctor could be held accountable to. But it was clear he was involved in the mistreatment of prisoners, and that his actions led to the deaths of hundreds. On the 13th of December 1945, Klaus Schilling was sentenced to death by hanging, and his execution took place on the 28th of May 1946. He was held inside of Landsberg Prison, and this would be the place where he was executed. Inside of the courtyard of the prison, a large gallows had been set up, and it was on these gallows where hundreds were executed on. These gallows took the lives of many Nazi war criminals, and Klaus Schilling would be one of those. He was led out of his prison, and was flanked by US Army guards, and many prison officers who looked on in the courtyard. He was also accompanied by a priest, who went with him to his death. Schilling then had his identity confirmed, before he made his way up the steps, and was handed over to the executioner. He had his arms tied behind his back, before an executioner placed a black hood over his head, and then the noose, which was attached to the gallows. Schilling was then shuffled over the trapdoor, before very quickly the executioner pulled the lever, and he plunged through the structure to his death. After his execution, doctors confirmed his death, and his remains were then placed in a coffin, marked Dr. Schilling, Klaus. Despite never joining the Nazi Party or the SS, Klaus Schilling was treated like other Nazi war criminals. He was a man who claimed for his research that it was necessary to kill hundreds of innocent people, which was ridiculous to consider. During the course of his work in Dachau, over 1,000 prisoners were deliberately infected with a dangerous disease that could kill, and they were also injected with a variety of medications that were often lethal. He was 74 when he went to the gallows at Landsberg Prison, and Klaus Schilling's execution remains a compelling one, and one that is slightly different to other Nazi war criminals. Inside of the courtroom of the Dachau trials, defendant number 24 stood up, and he walked over to a wooden chair in the middle of the room. Flanked on each side of him were the prosecution and the defence, and many other former concentration camp guards and co-defendants looked on. He was wearing a long black leather coat, synonymous with the SS or the German army officers, but Rudolf Heinrich Suttrop was considered an experienced Nazi. He was born on the 17th of July 1911 in Lernen, and it's believed he had a rather normal upbringing, but in September 1933, when he was just 22, he joined the Nazi Party. At this time, Hitler and the Nazis were trying to establish a power base, and Hitler that year would rise to the position of Chancellor, and would then begin to negotiate his way into becoming the dictator. At this time, thousands of people each week, like Suttrop, were joining the Nazi Party, and membership at this time was in the millions. But he would then join the SS, Heinrich Himmler's paramilitary group of soldiers and officers who would carry out any order that Hitler stated, including the purge known as the Night of the Long Knives. It's not known for certain why the Nazi Party appealed to Suttrop, but many people were bowled over by Hitler's promises to fix the issues following the First World War, and they wanted to feel proud of their Germany again. However, because of his work in the SS, Rudolf Heinrich Suttrop would then find himself based inside of a number of different concentration camps, and the first one he worked in was known as Sachsenburg. This was a site found in eastern Germany, and it was one of the first to be built by the Nazis, and the SS operated it from 1933 to 1937. It was an abandoned 4-storey textile mill, which was renovated to serve as protective custody for those who were dissenting against the Nazis, such as Jehovah's Witnesses and also communists. It was inside Sachsenburg where the SS began to use coloured triangles to identify different types of prisoners, and also armbands to identify the category of inmates. The camp held approximately 2,000 prisoners and opposers to the Nazi regime, and it's believed that there was an immense amount of brutality carried out by the SS guards. Records revealed that there were 11 prisoners killed at the camp, and this was a time before the final solution and years before the Second World War even begun. But it's believed that many more may have been killed inside of Sachsenburg. But following spending time here, Suttrop was then moved to become a guard inside of the newly opened Buchenwald concentration camp. Buchenwald would become, during the Second World War, one of the most infamous and brutal camps, with guards such as Ilse Koch and her husband Karl Otto Koch overseeing a reign of terror and brutality. The camp opened in August 1937, and prisoners came from all over Europe, and of the 280,000 prisoners that passed through the site, around 56,000 were killed. All the prisoners were forced to conduct hard labour, and they were given insufficient food rations, and there was execution all around the camp. There was a firing range and also sets of gallows where prisoners would be condemned from. Suttrop was one of the first guards, but when the Second World War broke out, he left Buchenwald to go and fight on the front line, and he was transferred into the Waffen-SS, the military detachment of the group, and he would also become part of the Totenkopf Division, or the Death's Heads unit, responsible for the slaughter of thousands of civilians. But following his experiences on the battlefields of the Second World War, Rudolf Heinrich Suttrop then went back into the concentration camps, and he was employed as an adjutant or assistant to the commandant of the Gross-Rosen camp. He served Arthur Roedel and would become a key player in the deadly destructive nature of Gross-Rosen. Further transfers occurred, and from May 1942 to May 1944, Suttrop worked as a deputy camp commander or as an assistant to many commandants of Dachau. Dachau was a horrific camp associated with torture. There were many sadistic methods used to inflict suffering onto inmates, such as daily public executions, and also there were standing cells, tiny oubliette-style dungeons where a prisoner would be locked in one position, stood up for days. Suttrop was clearly trusted inside of Dachau, as he would serve under a number of different commanders and commandants, and he would be responsible for the interests and actions of 235 command staff, and he would be in charge of handling letters and correspondence, which was sent from Himmler. He was also in control of telecommunications, and he managed the fleet of vehicles and also the command offices. He would give regular advice to the commandants too, but he was seen as an able deputy. But if the war would have continued, it's likely that he would have been given command of his own concentration camp at some point. From the 15th of May 1944 to March 1945, he was moved back to Gross-Rosen to serve under Johannes Hasselbroek and to oversee the final days of the camp. But at the end of the war, he would try to flee, but he was then quickly detained by the American army, and he would then be sent back to Dachau to go up in front of a judge in the Dachau trials for his actions inside of different concentration camps. There were dozens of defendants in these trials, and Suttrop was seen as one of the most senior and experienced guards, but inside of the courtroom there was a problem. There was actually little proof that he had committed murder, execution and slaughter with his own hands, and there were not too many witnesses that claimed Suttrop did this. However, it was clear he was responsible for the conditions of the camps where he worked. He was charged with assisting and participating in the crimes of Dachau concentration camp, and for this was sentenced to death. He was not necessarily tried for the crimes he had participated in at different sites, but as the assistant to the commandants of Dachau, he was seen as one of those who was mostly responsible for the slaughter with regards to the conditions of the camp. For a brief period of a few months, Rudolf Heinrich Suttrop was sent to Landsberg Prison to await his execution, along with the other condemned during the Dachau trials. On the 28th of May 1946, Suttrop was summoned from his prison cell, and in the courtyard of the prison was a huge set of gallows, which would be used to condemn hundreds of Nazi war criminals. He was led out into the courtyard by many military policemen, and would be accompanied by a priest, who would hear his final words. Suttrop was led up the stairs of the gallows, and his arms and legs had been secured, and waiting for him at the top of the gallows was the executioner. Final preparations and checks were made, including checking his arms and legs were secure. He was then shuffled over the trap door, and a cap was placed over his head, and then also the noose was, and the executioner then released the trap door, and Rudolf Heinrich Suttrop was executed, and after a few minutes he was cut down, and then placed in a coffin. The whole world knows about the awful crimes of many of the most high-profile Nazis, but the crimes of guards such as Rudolf Heinrich Suttrop are often overlooked and forgotten about. As a deputy or assistant to the commandants, he was answerable for the conditions of the sites, and also the evils that took place in camps such as Dachau and Gross Rosen. It was his job to oversee the guards in their brutality, and at the end of the war he was condemned for his crimes. Vinzenz Schertl was born on the 30th of June 1905 in Appersdorf in Bavaria, and it's assumed that he had a rather normal early life and upbringing. In 1928 he would get married, and he and his wife had 5 children, and for work he would work inside of an office as a cashier or a small-scale accountant. But Vinzenz Schertl then became very early on interested in the politics of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler, and he would join up very early in 1928, but he officially became a fully paid-up member of the Nazi Party on the 1st of February 1931. It's believed that he had attended many rallies, and he would have seen Hitler speak, and his local area was literally where the Nazis were seeking to take control of during the Munich Putsch, and it was considered the heartland of the Third Reich where they began. But also he would join the SS, Heinrich Himmler's later paramilitary group, which was at this time rather small, and no one at the time would have imagined what a brutal and barbaric force they would become, as they were the ones who were involved in the running of the concentration camps, and the slaughter that would happen there within the barbed wire fences every single day. But on the 30th of January 1933, Vinzenz Schertl then was recruited to go and work inside the first Nazi concentration camp that was opened, Dachau. Dachau would become a huge complex as the Nazi stranglehold over Germany ramped up, and it would become incredibly deadly. It was a site which was synonymous with torture and execution, with terrifying torture chambers such as the standing cells found there, and many people were executed by hanging or by gunshots within Dachau or close by. Throughout its time in operation, there were at least 41,500 people killed inside of Dachau, with its estimated 188,000 people passing through the barbed wire fences. The prisoners of the camp would live in constant fear that their lives were coming to an end, and people would be hanged from trees and would be flogged in front of others. Disease was also rife at Dachau, as was ill treatment by the guards who would hit and beat prisoners, often resulting in them being seriously injured and even killed. Inside of Dachau, Schertl would work with Martin Weiss, another guard who also became rather senior, and the pair would work together many times throughout their careers. But whilst at Dachau, Schertl was known for being involved in the terrible mistreatment of prisoners. But after staying at Dachau around 4 years, he was headhunted by the SS to go and work at a different site. This was known as Herzog-Salzmüller, and this was a small concentration camp which was strictly used for travellers. Schertl was employed as a house manager, and he would be responsible for those inmates and their behaviour, and inside this house people were brutally beaten and they were then executed. Those who were regarded by the Nazis as asocial were sent there, and they would then be executed. Following his time at this site, he was promoted in September 1938 to the rank of Untersturmführer, and he would then be drafted to go and work following the outbreak of the Second World War in Lublin, and to work inside the Lublin ghetto. The Nazis wanted to punish the Polish population, and Schertl to begin with worked as a train driver for the news department of the SS, and he would ferry different members of the group around. But then, looking for something more brutal, he from June 1940 became a guard soldier of the Lublin ghetto. His letters from this time would show his true beliefs about the Nazi ideology, and his feelings towards the Polish population. He wrote, "The Polish population looks quite neglected. I have already asked what happens to the Polish beggars, antisocials, etc. They are all used in Germany," alluding to the fact they were killed. He would also write weeks later, "Here it is to the devil, the dark and degenerate faces of the Poles. Sloppy and dirty Jews meet you at every turn. In the ghetto it looks bleak, all rubble and ashes. It should be difficult to build a hiking yard here in Poland. Every Pole who has no work so far would have to register and then come to Germany. This crooked human material, while sitting around on the street, is so depraved that it disgusts you directly when you look at it. Then this gang is not to be trusted either. We always have to go to the street as a couple, so that nothing can happen to anyone so easily. Following this, Vincent Schertel then went to work back inside of the concentration camps, this time at Neuengamme. Inside of this camp, 42,900 people of the 106 that were held were killed at the brutal sight. Every prisoner at the camp was starving, and most died within 3 weeks of getting to the camp. Every prisoner at the camp was starving, and most died within 3 months of getting to the camp, and the portions available were not good enough to sustain human life. Dysentery was also very common, and this killed thousands, and life at the camp was a struggle every single day. The Nazis clearly wanted the prisoners to die through labour and working, and the medical situation was incredibly poor. There was a gas chamber there, and Schertel would work here under Martin Weiss, his close ally. He wrote whilst at the camp, "The task that is given to me here is anything but easy. I much prefer to be a carer. While you go through thick and thin with the leader, and no task must be too difficult for you, until we finally attach a victory to our flag." And with this he showed he would do anything Hitler and Himmler ordered. He would also write, "A lousy task that we got. Here you sit half in the prison, half in the grave. I never want to go to a concentration camp again in my life." Following some time at Neuengamme, he was then transferred to be a camp leader of Auschwitz III Monowitz and the Pacific Buna Werke site in 1944. Monowitz was the IG Farben chemical plant inside of Auschwitz's complex, where workers and prisoners would conduct back-breaking work each day, which was very dangerous, and it was a slave labour site. He was the director of the site, showing how senior he was, but then as time went on he would be moved from Monowitz to go and work as a deputy commandant under Otto Fürchner of the Kaufering concentration camp, which was a sub-camp yet again of Dachau. He stayed here until later in the war, when the camp was evacuated, but he would then, following the end of the conflict, be arrested by the American army. He was brought to the first Dachau trials, which were overseen by the Americans, at the very camp where he had exhibited brutality over prisoners, and Vincent Schertel was charged with the crimes he had committed there, and also within the subcamps. He claimed to the courtroom that he had been only carrying out orders that were given to him by a superior officer, and that he would have faced death himself if he hadn't have done this. But regardless of this, the American courtroom found him guilty, and along with the last commandant Martin Weiss, Vincent Schertel was sentenced to death. He was imprisoned at Landsberg Prison for a number of months, and he would then on the 28th of May 1946 be executed for his crimes inside of Dachau and other camps. He was kept in his cell until the moment of his execution came, and inside of the courtyard of Landsberg Prison was a gallows structure which would take the lives of many Nazi war criminals. Schertel was led from his cell, and he was accompanied by a priest who would hear his last words, and also many military policemen who would chaperone him up to the gallows. He walked up the stairs of the gallows and was then greeted by the executioner, who, following his identity being confirmed, prepared him for his execution. The black cap was placed over his head, and then the noose was too, and with this final checks were made, and the executioner released a trapdoor, and within minutes Vincent Schertel was executed and killed. Vincent Schertel was an experienced SS guard who worked at many different concentration camps, and he became in charge of part of Auschwitz. He was a man who was known for his brutality, and he would carry out beatings regularly of the inmates, but at the end of the Second World War he was condemned for his involvement in the concentration camps. Inside the same prison that Hitler was held decades before, Schertel was executed on a gallows, along with many other former guards of Dachau. Engelbert Valentin Niedermeyer was born on the 26th of December 1911, and little is known about his early life, but he was an early member of the Nazi Party. Hitler promised to increase the power of Germany on the national stage, and he also wanted to repair the wounds of the defeat of the First World War, and millions of people joined his political party. Following Heinrich Himmler's call to action, Niedermeyer then joined the SS, Himmler's paramilitary group, and he was then from May 1934 sent to go and work inside the concentration camps. He was sent to Dachau, the first major camp that opened, and this was known for its torture and horrific treatment of prisoners. Over 188,000 people would be held behind the barbed wire fences of Dachau, and over 41,000 people died in the site. It was a place where much torture was administered, in the form of standing cells and at the hands of violent and ruthless guards who were known for executing prisoners with their own hands. Inside of Dachau, Niedermeyer rose to the position of a command leader, and he was responsible for a prisoner commando, and his group were building different parts of Dachau as the site expanded heavily. In November 1941, he was then given a job inside of the crematoria of the camp, and he was a number of SS men who oversaw the burning of many people who died inside the camp, and who succumbed to the conditions. He was dealing with many executed bodies, but also he was drafted in to become part of the firing squad. Thousands of Soviet prisoners of war were sent to Dachau for their executions, and Niedermeyer was one of many executioners who dispatched these prisoners of war with ruthlessness. Many of these victims were not even recorded on the camp's records, as they were shot in the firing ranges just outside of the camp. Niedermeyer continued to serve inside of Dachau during the Second World War, and he was also responsible for the telecommunications inside and out of the camp for the commandant. But from February 1943, Niedermeyer was then taken from Dachau to go and serve on the front lines of the Second World War, as the war was turning against the Germans. This happened with many guards of the concentration camps, as they began to be replaced by auxiliaries, and many women who joined the SS retinue. But Niedermeyer, at the end of the war, was then arrested, and he was then inside captivity under the American military. His crimes as a guard inside the concentration camps were uncovered, and he was brought to the Dachau trials. The courtroom heard of his actions, which included the brutal treatment of prisoners and the torture of them, and also being involved in the executions of prisoners of war. On the 13th of December 1945, he was condemned to death alongside a number of other former guards of Dachau, and he was then sent to Landsberg Prison to await his death sentence. Appeals for clemency were launched on Niedermeyer's behalf, but these were all rejected, and before his execution was to take place, he wrote a letter to his wife and stated, "Stay happy in your life. Don't forget you are a German woman. Never forget that I died innocent. One day the day will come when our innocence will take revenge. You can rely on that. In the hope of a better future, I die for you, and therefore for Germany, and say goodbye to you." On the 28th of May 1945, Engelbert Valentin Niedermeyer was summoned from his prison cell, and he was walked by the American military policeman and a priest into the courtyard of Landsberg Prison, where the gallows stood. This execution structure took the lives of hundreds at the end of the war, and Niedermeyer had his identity confirmed at the bottom of this, and he was then helped up the stairs. On the scaffold stood the American executioner, who was there to bring the former guard of Dachau's life to an end. He worked quickly and took possession of Niedermeyer, who then had a black cap thrown over his head, followed by the noose. The executioner then shuffled him over the trapdoor and pushed the lever, and Engelbert Niedermeyer plunged to his death. He was one of the Second World War's most brutal and prolific concentration camp guards, and Niedermeyer remained inside of Dachau Concentration Camp, and he never really transferred to other sites like many guards, who were summoned to work inside of expanding camps such as Auschwitz. He also served on the front lines in presumably the Waffen-SS, but he was a man who was responsible for the executions of many prisoners, and in the burnings of the bodies of those who succumbed to their deaths inside of Dachau Concentration Camp. Leonhard Anshelm Eichberger was born on the 22nd of January 1915, and he, like many people inside of Germany, joined the Nazi Party. When Adolf Hitler came to power in the 1930s, the German population flocked to join the Nazis in their millions, and Hitler promised to rebuild Germany as a power across Europe, and he also wanted to restore the pride of the nation, following the damaging defeat of the First World War, and the fact that the Treaty of Versailles ordered the Germans to take account and guilt for causing World War I. But Eichberger went further than just being a paid-up member of the Nazi Party, and he answered Heinrich Himmler's call to arms and action, and he wanted to become a member of the paramilitary group, the SS. The SS would, during the Second World War, have a military wing which became one of the most feared groups of soldiers on the battlefields, and they were the most ardent of Nazis. They were incredibly devoted to Hitler and also Himmler, but inside of the SS there were also thousands of people who later became concentration camp guards and members of staff. At the end of the war, membership to the SS was regarded as membership of a criminal organisation, and this was something someone could be punished with at least prison time for. Eichberger joined the SS on the 1st of April 1935, and it was clear that the group was possibly becoming a military unit one day. But after a few years he then joined the German army and was part of the Wehrmacht from 1937, and he saw action on the front lines of the war as it broke out. But then in 1943 he was invalided out of the German army as he had suffered a hugely significant wound on the battlefield, and he had his lower left leg amputated, meaning that his days on the front lines were now over. But because of this, the SS then found alternative work for him, and he was then sent into the concentration camp systems to work as many wounded members of the SS were. The camp where Eichberger was sent to was Dachau, and this was the first camp which opened inside the Third Reich. Dachau Concentration Camp opened on the 22nd of March 1933, and it has been considered the first concentration camp that was planned to hold political prisoners and dissidents to begin with, but then as the Second World War erupted, thousands of other people found themselves sent there. It grew to a huge complex in size and was served by around 100 subcamps, and thousands of Jewish people were sent to the camp. The prisoners were forced to work incredibly hard, and they would be executed if they did not, or subject to punishment and torture ordeals, such as the standing cells. The prisoners were closely guarded, and some guards shot prisoners without reason or justification, almost for sport. The guards also stole the inmates' caps and threw them into no man's land, so when the prisoners went to retrieve them near to the fence, the guards in the watchtowers would shoot them. Beatings were very regular at Dachau, and some prisoners were even beaten to death, and horrific torture methods as mentioned were also used. Prisoners were regularly strung up by their arms if they were found to have breached the rules, and the SS also used a firing range found nearby to execute prisoners who were said to have not been fit enough to work. They also used the gallows to hang prisoners in front of others at roll call. As the Second World War continued, the prisoners of Dachau rose in their numbers, and in the final months of the war, the conditions at the site were even more tragic than they had ever been. The Allies were pushing towards Germany, in the heart of the Nazi regime. They were stumbling across a number of different concentration camps, and what they later found at Dachau was pure horror. There was in the final days a severe lack of food at Dachau, and also disease, and there was little to no water for the hugely overcrowded site. It had a fearsome reputation, and over 188,000 prisoners were held there, and over 41,000 were killed at the camp. Inside of Dachau, Leonhard Eichberger's work was involved in the protective custody camp and in managing this site. The tasks he performed were recording executions and also interrogating political prisoners, and he remained at the camp until its liberation. Also, Eichberger got involved in the executions of prisoners. He later admitted in his actions to have shot at least 5 or 6 of the 90 Soviet prisoners of war who had arrived at the camp to be killed. He was part of the firing squads and the executioners who, with their weapons, dispatched with ruthlessness many innocent people. These prisoners should have been looked after, but instead they were slaughtered. Eichberger later admitted that he personally shot another 15 prisoners who remained at Dachau. He was an executioner, but at the end of the Second World War he was rounded up and was captured by the American forces. He was then brought forward as a member of the Dachau trials, and he stood as a defendant alongside 39 other members of staff who had worked at the camp, and the trial actually took place within the former buildings of Dachau. Eichberger was accused of the violation of the laws and customs of war, and he was accused of being involved in the executions and torture of prisoners within the protective custody camp of Dachau. But he tried to defend himself, saying he dispatched prisoners as there was a state of emergency on at the time, and that his actions were justifiable, but of course this was no legitimate defence. Many witnesses and former prisoners of Dachau testified about the actions of Eichberger and the other defendants, and they told what a brutal guard he really was. The courtroom found him guilty, and Eichberger was then sentenced to death by the court. During the verdict, the judges outlined Eichberger's actions, and they said he was involved in the brutal interrogations of hundreds of inmates, and that he was responsible for between 150 to 200 executions, and that he also prepared the reports on these killings, as well as pulling the trigger himself. Because of this, he was condemned, and he was sent to Landsberg Prison to await his execution date. There were appeals for clemency launched, but these were all rejected, and his death sentence was said to have been justified as he voluntarily executed prisoners and prisoners of war. On the 29th of May 1946, inside of Landsberg Prison, roughly 6 weeks after he had been sentenced, Leonhard Eichberger was summoned from his prison cell, and he was told by the American military policeman that he was to be executed imminently. He was led from the prison block to the courtyard where the gallows stood. On the platform was the executioner, and Eichberger was led towards the steps, where he had his identity confirmed, and he was then helped up the stairs onto the platform. The executioner approached him, and then made sure his arms and legs were secured, and he then placed him over the trapdoor. A photographer took a final image of him, and then the executioner placed a cap and the noose over his head before he released the trapdoor. He went through the trapdoor with haste, and sometime later he was cut down, and his body was placed inside of a coffin. Leonhard Eichberger was a ruthless and brutal executioner and torturer who saw much action during the Second World War as part of the Wehrmacht, but inside of Dachau, the oldest site, he was one of many terrifying guards who were responsible for the deaths and terrible treatment of thousands of inmates. Dachau was known for being a very tough camp, and it was guards such as Eichberger who were responsible for this terror.
Josef Yarolin was born on the 6th of March 1904 in Red Point, and he would during the Second World War become rather senior inside of the SS, and he would become a camp leader inside of one of Dachau's subcamps. But before this he joined the Bavarian State Police at the age of 19 in 1923, and he would then work as an officer for 8 years. But he was then released from the force as he suffered from a bout of severe illness, but on the 1st of May 1933, Yarolin joined the Nazi Party, and he was member number 3,205,438. Many people around this time joined the Nazi Party, and they would be bowled over by the policies of Hitler and the Nazis, and Hitler had promised to restore pride in Germany following the defeat of the First World War. He also promised German people a return to the European stage with regards to politics, and he would also guarantee that they would be fed and would have stable work. This led to a huge influx of people officially joining the Nazi Party, and Hitler would then work to eradicate his enemies in politics. However, Yarolin must have been a huge fan of Hitler, and he would then, 2 years later in March 1935, join the SS, Heinrich Himmler's paramilitary group, who would become infamous for their running of the concentration camps. The SS would become those guards who worked inside of the camps, and at this time Dachau Concentration Camp had been open a number of years. Yarolin underwent SS training, then worked for a year as a guard in Berlin before he then transferred to work at Sachsenhausen Concentration Camp. Many SS guards would work at different camps before they would move to others, and Sachsenhausen was found relatively close to Berlin, and Yarolin must have been sent to his local site. Here thousands of prisoners would never make it out of the camp alive, and thousands would be executed inside, on the gallows, and also on the firing ranges and shooting facilities. It was also seen as a training site for the SS, and many guards, including Josef Yarolin, would start their career at Sachsenhausen, and many of those who trained here would later become high-ranking members of the SS, and it was seen as a training centre for the future concentration camp commandants. But on the 1st of September 1938, Yarolin was then transferred across to Dachau Concentration Camp, and he worked there as a Rapport leader, or Rapport Führer. It was his job to keep an eye on a number of prisoners, and he would also be in charge of administering beatings and carrying out executions. The prisoners of Dachau were living every day in fear, and they were subjected to torture inside of the standing cells, tiny prison rooms in which inmates were locked standing up in one position for days on end. This was physical and mental torture. They also had to witness hangings on the gallows to strike fear into the hearts. There were also floggings carried out in public, and also pole hangings, and there were around 40,000 prisoners who never made it out of the camp alive. Thousands of prisoners of war from the Red Army would be sent to the camp, and thousands were executed on the firing range near to the site. Yarolin continued to rise throughout the ranks inside of Dachau, and he was promoted in December 1941 to 3rd Protective Custody Camp Leader, and he would report to the custody camp leader, Franz Hoffmann. In this role it was his job to ensure that no prisoners escaped, and along with other guards, he would punish those who tried to do so. There was often collective responsibility for the inmates, who were said to have escaped, but Yarolin would become infamous for his actions during executions. Those who tried to escape would be hanged in the roll call yards to make sure that prisoners saw their actions, and they needed to know what would happen if they also tried to escape. But Yarolin would act as a hangman, and during some executions he became known for his sadistic actions. It was said at his trial by one witness and former prisoner that Yarrolin pushed hanging men so they swung to and fro, then beat these prisoners with a bullwhip that was twisted and dried hard on their faces and their backs, in front and on their shoulders. The prisoners were bleeding. They were Germans, foreigners, and all nationalities. This happened throughout his tour of duty from 1942 until 1943, when Yarrolin was transferred from there. The former prisoner who described his actions was known as Helmut Opitz, and he would state that Yarrolin, whilst prisoners were hanging, would beat them and brutalise them. But then in March 1943, Yarrolin was promoted yet again, and he must have been trusted by Heinrich Himmler, as he was made the camp leader or the commandant of the Dachau subcamp found in Munich Alasch. Inside of this camp, prisoners would be forced to make engines for BMW that would then be used in aircraft and other vehicles. Yarrolin in this would lead a group of guards who were known as a brutal arbitrary regiment, and they would inflict a significant amount of suffering onto the inmates, and presumably slaughter prisoners who were not working hard enough. Death was common at the camp due to poor food supplies, the atrocities of the SS and Yarrolin's guards, and there was also a lack of sanitation and hygiene. Because of these final points, disease broke out, and tuberculosis, typhus and scabies caused big problems. But at the end of the Second World War, Josef Yarrolin was brought to the Dachau trials, along with 39 other members of the camp's staff. He would be tried with violating the laws and customs of war and in mistreatment of civilians and prisoners of war. He was also said to have been responsible for the conditions of Dachau that caused so much death and slaughter, and a large number of witnesses came forward to testify about his actions. Former prisoners said he often beat prisoners until they were knocked out and lost consciousness in the administration building of the Dachau site. He was also present on the 1st of July 1942, when 12 prisoners were subject to be hanged on poles, and Yarrolin ordered the inmates to be hung higher, causing more suffering. He would admit before the trial to some of his actions, and Yarrolin claimed he had tied prisoners up and beat them with an ox whip during interrogations. He was also involved, it was discovered, in the executions of 700 Soviet POWs, and that he gave the orders to the execution squads who shot through the victims, and it was discovered he himself had shot between 30 to 40 prisoners. Yarrolin also claimed he was involved in the selections of prisoners who were then sent to Camp Dr. Sigmund Rascher, who would then carry out sadistic human experimentation on them. He was also said to have witnessed much of this, and when he got to the subcamp he would administer floggings and hangings from stakes. Because of these actions, on the 13th of December 1945, Josef Yarrolin was sentenced to death and was sent to Landsberg Prison to await his execution. His death sentence was then confirmed on the 5th of April 1946, but on the 28th of May 1946, Josef Yarrolin was summoned from his prison cell, and he was then led out into the courtyard of Landsberg Prison. He was surrounded by American military policemen and was led towards a huge wooden gallows in the centre of the yard. As he approached the bottom of the steps, Yarrolin's identity was confirmed, and a priest remained with him. He was led up the stairs and then handed over to the executioner, who secured his arms and legs together, and he was then shuffled over the trapdoor. The executioner then placed a black cap over his head, and then the noose, and he quickly released the trapdoor, and Yarrolin, one of the most evil guards of Dachau, plunged through to his death. Much is known about the crimes of some of the most high-profile German war criminals, and those of the Nuremberg trials, but there is much less told about the crimes of men such as Josef Yarrolin, those who each day would inflict suffering and pain onto the prisoners on the front line. He was an ardent Nazi, and for his crimes was brought for his execution, and Yarrolin's crimes were endless. He was an executioner, a murderer, a torturer, and a sadist, who would virulently carry out the horrific actions and policies of the SS.
George Schallemer was born on the 29th of December 1894 inside of Hebertshausen, and little is known about his early life. But for a career before the Second World War broke out, he worked as a builder. He was a member of the Nazi Party and was a strict follower of Hitler's politics, like so many people were across Germany at the time. But during the guise of the conflict, he would become a brute and a barbaric guard who served inside of the concentration camps. Schallemer served inside of the German army in the Wehrmacht until 1944, and he would then be drafted across to the Waffen-SS and he would serve under the SS inside of the concentration camps. It's not known why Chalamet switched from the army to the concentration camps and why he left the front lines. One possibility is that he could have been injured in combat and then drafted to guard prisoners like many who were wounded would. Many concentration camp guards were sent the other way to the front lines at this time during the Second World War as things got desperate for the German army and they needed more forces to defend the Reich as they were being pushed back heavily. But from August 1944 to May 1945, Chalamet served under the Commandant Walter Adolf Langleist inside of the Mulhdorf concentration camp. This was a subcamp of Dachau and was found not too far from it, and the prisoners here were to work inside of underground tunnels, making the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter aircraft, which was considered one of Hitler's wonder weapons. The conditions at Mulhdorf were absolutely awful. The SS guards carried out selections at the camp, and prisoners who were sick or suffering, and those who had been injured, were sent to Auschwitz, and within hours of arriving at the camp, they had been exterminated inside of gas chambers and the deadliest concentration camp. In fact, more than half of the prisoners who were sent to Mulhdorf would be sent to the killing chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau, or they died at the site from overwork, shootings and executions, disease and violent beatings at the hands of the guards, such as Georges Chalamet. Prisoners were forced to work 10 to 12-hour days, carrying incredibly heavy bags of cement around. They were given hardly any food or access to sanitation. As the American army approached the site at the end of the war, the SS guards evacuated around 3,600 prisoners on death marches from the site. Georges Chalamet, in particular, was known for being a brutal guard. It was said that he was responsible for the conditions of the camp, along with the other guards, and for the lack of care given to the prisoners, which led to the deaths of a large number of inmates through illness and starvation. He was also accused of having beaten many prisoners to death with his bare hands, and also in administering beatings that were not asked of him, meaning he took the law of the camp into his own hands. He was also, shockingly, accused of a particularly heinous crime, and that was having overseen the removal of gold teeth from those prisoners who died and forcing an inmate doctor to do this. It was said of this specific crime that Georges Chalamet, as leader of the Roll Command, was directly responsible for the prisoners in Mulhdorf, a subcamp of Dachau. He himself beat many prisoners in such a way that they died of the result. Of 300 people who were brought to the camp in autumn 1944, only 72 were alive after 4 months. Every day he visited the morgue with a dentist, imprisoned, to break out the dead gold teeth. Many witnesses later came forward about the work of Georges Chalamet, and he was at the end of the Second World War brought to trial for his actions. The deaths that occurred at Mulhdorf were recorded in the camp's records, and it was said that Chalamet was a typical SS brute and a thug who had no regard for the lives of prisoners. When he spoke out in his defence, Chalamet claimed that he was only keeping law and order at the camp, and that he only ever punished inmates who had committed serious violations of the rules, and that he did this to keep prisoners in line. He also claimed he had never killed an inmate, and regarding the removal of prisoner teeth, he claimed he had actually been instructed to do this by a higher SS officer. However, on the 23rd of September 1947, the courtroom found Georges Chalamet guilty of war crimes, and he was sentenced to death, and was specifically to be sentenced to death by hanging. Before his death sentence was carried out, there were a number of reviews that confirmed his sentence. During one review it was said that the evidence clearly shows that the fact the defendant, as an SS Hauptscharführer and rapport leader in the Mulhdorf subcamp, was involved in the mass crimes in connection with the Dachau concentration camp. It is also clearly proven that the defendant personally abused and beat numerous camp inmates. Many of the inmates died as a result of the defendant's brutal beatings. The evidence justifies a guilty verdict. The sentence is not overly harsh. But in the years following this, there were calls by many people inside of Germany to release the prisoners who were sitting on death row, awaiting their executions in Landsberg Prison. Sometimes it took years for prisoners to be sent to the gallows, and many spent a long time inside of the prison before it was time for their date with the executioner. In fact, Hermann Pister, the commandant of Buchenwald, even died of a heart attack before his execution date inside of the prison. There were many reviews that were carried out to see if there was any justification to release Chalamet from his death sentence, but ultimately it was said that There are no facts or arguments that could in any way justify grace in this case. This meant that the death sentence of Chalamet was confirmed, and other legal groups tried their best to gain some form of clemency. On the 6th of June 1951, 6 years after the Second World War had come to an end, the US Supreme Court rejected the final motions regarding Chalamet's possible reprieve, and they argued that sparing him could send a dangerous message and encourage right-wing pro-Nazi tendencies and beliefs inside of Germany. It would be just a day later that they would carry out the execution of the former guard who had been sat on death row for many years, awaiting his execution. On the 7th of June 1951, George Chalamet was told it was his time to go and meet the executioner. He left his prison cell, and with him was a priest who offered him final blessings, and many American military policemen. They led him out to the courtyard where the gallows was found, and Chalamet's arms and legs were secured at the bottom of the steps of the gallows, and his identity was then confirmed. He was then helped by the military policeman up the stairs of the gallows and onto the scaffold where the executioner greeted him. He checked the binding of his arms and legs, and then shuffled him over to where the trapdoor could be found. A photographer took a final image of George Chalamet with his arms held by American guards. Then the executioner placed a black cap over his head and then secured the noose around his neck. Chalamet was then sent crashing through the trapdoor, and he was executed and was left dangling for a number of minutes before his death was confirmed. George Chalamet was one of many former concentration camp guards who were sent to the gallows in the years following the Second World War, but what is striking is that he was a soldier for the majority of the conflict, but found himself within the camps for just over a year. But he quickly became a brute and a beast who was responsible for a huge degree of slaughter and suffering, and some of the crimes he was accused of were truly evil and barbaric. Despite the calls for clemency, he was another victim of the gallows of Landsberg Prison. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.